just keeps hitting me hard this year. That's why I missed last week's video. Again. Sorry. But hey, it is now September. In New Zealand, we have transitioned from winter to spring, and I did a lot of book reviews. After the intro, we are literally just gonna dive straight in. My name is Amy Rosenfeld, and these are the books that I read and reviewed in the winter of 2023. We're kicking this off with number 13, An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon. The writing style brought down this novel a lot for me. This is not a book for everyone because of that writing style alone, and I would not call it accessible on the first read. I say as if I'm gonna do a second read. The plot had a lot of potential when paired with interesting world building, and the politics that were involved were very interesting too, as we saw the roles within the spaceship creating some sort of hierarchy of the upper class and the lower class through the different levels of the spacecraft. But more focus was put into sciences, a subject that I dropped the first chance I could in high school. I understand that it is a trope of sci-fi, and maybe I'm realizing how I don't like this specific sci-fi. Oh well. I still liked the politics in the sci-fi stuff, but all that was ruined for me by a confusing ending. To my knowledge, this book was a standalone, and yet it ended on too many disappointing uncertainties. Too much depression, too much hard work, to end in sadness for the main character, Aster. At number 12, we have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This was a collection of poetry strung together by absurd happenstance. No wonder people say this book has no plot. It was never the purpose, though I'm not quite sure why Carroll decided to frame the book in such a way. Or maybe that was just a trope of children's literature at the time. I'm not entirely sure, but it's weird when the poems are not what's considered iconic about this book. In the non-poetic parts, the fever trip is wonderful and whimsical, a very vivid world to have fun in all manner of sizes. But the further you went along in the plot, the more that you realized that there wasn't actually a plot and that there's just a bunch of poems being shoehorned in that I do not care about. At least I know that the sequel has more of a plot, so I'm gonna read it. Number 11 is Burn Down, Rise Up by Vincent Tirado. The world building and the connections between the real world and the unnatural world were stellar. This hinged on New York history. That was what hooked me and brought me into a world that is Dimension 20's Unsleeping City combined with Stranger Things. Everything was so richly integrated to see how the monsters were a personification of the troubles that happened in the Bronx in the 80s, and also how the humans who entered there got affected by this dark alternate world. However, the characters felt too much the same to each other, and that is a major red flag as someone who writes character-driven stories and prefers a character-driven story. I cannot tell you the personality of the characters to save my life. Raquel, Charlize, and every other character felt so much the same minus one trait. And my biggest annoyance here was that I felt the characters had it too easy. This is a dark fantasy, a fantasy that takes elements from horror. And I don't think that what they went through to be able to survive or get to their end game goal at the end was horrible enough. I like victory. It just didn't feel earned in the climax of this novel. The ending felt more suited to a middle grade story, but I know this was written as a YA story. It felt too enlightening to be a dark setting and therefore made a hollow conclusion. Number 10 is Dreadnought by April Daniels. We're starting off with the world building again. I enjoyed the superhero world building in this novel a great deal. This was both the politics and the way that the world had gotten used to superheroes, and also the way that everybody had their different magic and the ways that it changed them, including Danny's transition. That being said, it's another climax problem. The superhero battle was where things were let down for me. It felt like it extended on for too long, and you didn't need to have it that big. It's a staple of superhero films, but in book form, it just doesn't work. To me, the strongest parts of this novel were the trans experiences and struggles that Dani faced after her transition. I got close to tears multiple times while reading this novel because of those things and how personal and emotional all of this felt. That's a feat. I rarely cry at books, so it means you're doing something absolutely right. At number 9, we have The Miserable Mill by Lemony Snicket. A lot of this book I had forgotten the plot of before I read it again. I think I only remembered Count Olaf's disguise, but we have finally lost the repetitive storylines from the previous books, which is the one thing I was nervous about when rereading this. I was pleasantly surprised instead by the mystery elements in this book. This novel particularly leaned into the absurdity of the Baudelaire situation, and while it took a while for me to suspend my disbelief, it turned into some dark comedic angles later on in this plot. Children working in a mill with terrible conditions? It's a wonder that they got into such a position in the first place, knowing what comes up in later books that are arguably better. At number 8, we have Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This book is dense. The writing style made it at times difficult to follow, especially considering I didn't read parts of this book one day after the other. On account of my brain being so small, that's why I rated this book lower than it probably deserves. Because the characters and the book itself that I remember the most cohesively had so much character to it. It started off being very difficult to track who was who in the cast, but they ended up being very distinguishable and it paid off later on. Each pair of characters had their own flavor of undeath and undead magic to be able to bring to this table, and that made for something really cool in like an atmospheric way. And relationships also that stood out in powerful ways. The main selling point for this is the lesbian relationship between Harrow and Gideon. I don't ship it. It didn't feel developed enough for me to actually ship Harrow and Gideon. It didn't hit that enemies to lovers fantasy that everyone said it would be, and that kinda disappointed me. Number 7 is Fire by Kristen Kishore. This novel's predecessor, Graceling, was the epitome of a fantasy romance, so I was expecting much the same going into book 2. It wasn't as prominent or well developed, and that kind of made me double take. Similar to Gideon the Ninth, it felt like Fire and her love interest didn't spend enough time together or have enough meaningful moments for me to warrant this being a couple I would ship for or a relationship I would see happening. It did feel like the start of a relationship, but then all of a sudden they got, married. It felt like I missed a bunch of their chemistry. Where were the missing pages? Where did the missing pages go for me to see all that? But Fire on her own, she was absolutely stellar as a character. And the journey she took was a beautiful one. Initially, when I first read the direction this would be going, I thought it would be a tale where it would dive into women's wrongs, but she still had a very good heart in the end of it, as she dealt with a lot of morality and still came out as what would be a good character in my eyes. And this is also a completely different angle from the previous novel, so I'm looking forward to seeing how else the world is going to expand later in the series. Number 6 is Forbidden Healing by Rachel Watson. I discovered an indie author on TikTok making their namesake and promoting their book on this platform, and I got convinced enough to pick it up. I am so glad I did. This is a very impressive start to her storytelling, and especially with the spins that she took on it. Like, I never expected to enjoy a fantasy novel where a religion is the core part of this fantasy world. I really like this take, even though I'm not religious myself, but I like in certain fantasy things exploring the way religion is, or like the cultural impacts of religion in fantasy and a little bit in our real world as well. So this was really interesting to see. The first thing I always look out for in a book is to see if the characters are distinguishable. Watson got it. Their personalities and motivations were each very clear, and you could understand a lot of their perspectives and root for a lot of the good guys and hate a lot of the bad guys because she knew how to do it right. Well-rounded, distinct, and sometimes with tropes that hit too close to home. The only reason I won't rate this any higher is because of the two plots. Kyla's plot and Marlowe's plot had very different pacing, and it was very difficult to juggle the two. Watson did an adequate job, but I wouldn't call it a stellar job compared to other stories that have done similar things. Number 5 is The Little Match Girl Strikes Back by Emma Carroll. This is honestly just a quick read that I picked up to catch up with my reading goals because I am very behind right now. I finished this book in a day. It was a breeze to get through. Probably because it was for a middle grade audience, but it still had some very mature voices in it regardless. Children are smart, you know, at least when they get written about. But there is one bad strike I would give this novel, and that is pacing. The novel focused too much on the hope of the action that would be taken later on in the book, and it ended up leaving 2 chapters focusing on the actual strike at the match factory. It was brushed over and something I really wanted to look into, but you know, we didn't get that opportunity. Number 4 is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. Lowe's writing style is very captivating. It combined intellectual and insightful journeys through the mind with enchanting displays through the main character Lily's eyes. It was a very medium style, making it easy to read. You could still breeze stuff over, but you'd love to pick up and look at every single word in that story. Lily and Catherine were obvious favorite characters. They were very well-rounded, from their ambitions to them discovering their big fat lesbian crushes on each other. Furthermore, this book, from an outsider perspective, felt like a very good representation of urban Chinese culture in the 50s. I don't know much about it myself, obviously, but with media outputs of culture nowadays, I can tell a good one versus a bad one quite well now, and this is definitely a good one, especially with very niche aspects of urban Chinese culture. Number 3 is Pax by Sarah Pennypacker. Wow, this book was sad. It's a very wholesome tale that warms you up nonetheless, but it's still sad. There's nothing that hits me harder than 2 people who are absolutely loyal to each other and care about each other, have a deep connection that when they're split apart, they just have to find each other again. And they're fighting to keep their bond together from the start. I repeat, from the start. How can a book be so powerful to do that to me? This book has 2 POVs, from the boy, Peter, and Pax, his pet fox. I was expecting one to be stronger than the other, but they were both very equal. I have a bit of a favorite toward the fox's POV, however. I will say the ending felt too abrupt, but I heard that there was a sequel to this book. Number 2 is Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon Maguire. I was heavily entertained by the writing style of this book, which, even though this is book 2 in a series, I don't remember this being in the first book, but I'm so glad to have noticed it now. It was very reminiscent of classic children's literature, which is very interesting when paired with very mature themes and sometimes adult language and gore. This book's got a bit of gore in it, I will admit. But the youthful children's literature reminiscent writing style made it feel a lot more fantasy to me, a lot more whimsical, vivid, engaging, and emotionally attachable. Speaking of emotionally attachable, let's talk about the 2 main characters, Jacqueline and Jillian. We were introduced to them in their terrifying ways before this prequel. That's a weird statement. I never thought much about them on my first dive, but now I care for both of them so deeply now that I know their struggles of identity growing up. And they found peace in a morbid place, but it was one that accepted them for who they wanted to be. My only complaint about this, I wanted more. There was like a 10-year time skip. Well, maybe not that long, but it felt like that long because they changed so much, and I wanted to see the development of those changes so badly. I want to read an entire 12-part series about Jack and Jill. I want to see them learn lessons and transform. We had a beautiful before, an extravagant after, but a missing middle, it felt like. Thus, I had to deduct half a star from this otherwise masterpiece. Number 1's another 5-star, and with the way that these have been going, you would not be surprised. At number 1, we have The Titan's Curse by Rick Riordan. I know, I am so predictable now. I love Percy Jackson. As a kid, this book was my favorite because it had my favorite character in it, Talia. As usual, characters were a highlight. Percy constantly steals the spotlight, but credit is also due to Talia. I can see why she's my favorite. And Zoe. A second highlight in this installment was the darker tones. It was instantly misleading that this novel that's typically following a summer camp plotline takes place in the winter, and it set up beautifully what was to come. This is not what you're used to. Things are about to change, and I still can't get over the mastery of Riordan's world building. The world gets expanded further as Riordan introduces us to new players in this game, in ways that completely make sense. Let's hope I can DNF another book in the near future and pick up the next installment soon. Have you read any of my winter reads? Let me know your thoughts on them in the comments below, and sorry not sorry if I trashed one of your favorites. But if you did enjoy this video, give it a like and be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every week on writing books and digital content for authors. If you're looking for something new to read this spring, ASTER'S CODA exposure, my book, my baby. Follow Abby Taka as she dives into the three worlds and discovers her place in it in the midst of an otherworldly blood feud. And also, do check in the description to find my Instagram, my TikTok, and my website where you can check out more detailed reviews of the books that I've mentioned here. Stay creative, everybody. I'll see you in the next video.